of Professor Mary Murphy's book, Creating an Ecosocial Welfare Future, which I'm really looking forward to. There are copies here for purchase, and Mary can sign them if you so desire. It is also available in Queen's University Library on the electronic system, if you also want to read it that way. So I'm delighted to have Mary up here to launch this, because Mary's project has been for a long time, we was chatting about it beforehand. It's about bringing together issues of what we now would call intersectional justice, gender, class, race, with issues around climate and ecological justice, particularly in the context of, in many respects, what we've experienced this summer. I mean, you couldn't have asked for a better and worse time in a way to launch such a book, given that I read one report that said a third of humanity at some point in this summer was suffering a heat wave. You know, the devastating fires in Corfu in Greece, which is interesting in many respects, because those, you know, storm in Libya. And even here locally, I mean, many of us have been obsessed, probably too wrong a word, but we have the killing of Loch Ness here locally. The largest freshwater lake in these islands supplies 40% of the drinking water here for people in the north. And in a way, it's the ecological heart of this part of Ireland. And it's been destroyed by effluent from farming, from slurry, and also there's a climate change dimension too, because as the water is warming up in Loch Ness, it increases the capacity of this blue-green algae. So even here locally, we're now beginning to see the impacts of the climate and ecological disaster. So I'm going to hand over to Mary to talk about her book. But before that, I'm going to just show a quick video, and hopefully those online can follow.
From Maynooth University, this book, Creating an Ecosocial Welfare Future, was written to spark a conversation between people who care about inequality and people who care about climate change. I believe they're part of the same problem, and everyone needs to see these links. The political economy of 21st century capitalism over-focuses on growth, leading to social inequality, overconsumption and environmental degradation. The solution lies in progressing equality and environmental sustainability as interlinked goals. Achievement of each depends on the other. This requires institutional imagination. Ecosocial welfare can enable values and behaviours to evolve. For example, shifting from production and consumption towards other forms of participation, like care, for example. The book looks at the first steps towards ecosocial welfare: universal basic services and participation income. They need to be achieved in a short time frame, building on tools and ideas we have now. While globally relevant, the book anchors the discussion as an Irish case study. I hope this book appeals to people studying or working to improve local and global inequality and/or working as climate activists. And it gives strategies and vocabulary to achieve the mobilisation and transitions needed to create social transformation. Find out more, and you can buy this book on ecosocial.ie.
Isn't that the best introduction to
an
academic
home now.
Absolutely. You've raised the bar there, Gary. So I'll hand it over to...
Yeah, I'm looking, thank you very much, John and Callum, for doing the backdrop organisation on it. And thanks to people in the room and those online. And as you can see from the video, I'm very much bringing this book to you in the hopes of trying to contribute to a conversation. And the video is important, I suppose, in showing you how I believe we need to do some things differently in order to get that conversation. So I would think of myself primarily as a pracademic rather than an academic, in that I would come from a backdrop of working in NGOs, the National Organisation of the Unemployed, welfare, anti-poverty organisations, equality organisations. I was also a politician in Dublin City Council, and then I moved into academia. So I think it's really important to bring all of that with you as you go forward, and for academic work to talk out of academy back into society, and to bring society into the academy as much as we can. So in writing the book, I was very mindful of, I didn't want to write an academic book, no offence to academic books, but there's lots of them around and they don't get read enough and they don't have enough impact on everyday life and politics. So what I really wanted to do was contribute to what I feel needs to be a really increased momentum of conversation, which really talks about climate change and inequality together with the same understanding and the same framework for what needs to happen to try and advance solutions to both of them simultaneously. And John and I were just chatting there about that movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. But it is a bit like that we actually need to be doing everything we can all the time, all at once, even if it feels a bit over the top at the time. I think the type of scenario that John pointed out there in terms of the intensity of what we're experiencing as real climate change points to us that the urgency that we need politically really cannot be overestimated, and what we need to do cannot be underestimated. So that's the context of the book. It's not meant to be academic, it's meant to draw on a lot of academic theory, but it's meant to present it quite lightly so that it's quite accessible. And my hope is that things like the video and an accompanying website, ecosocial.ie, that they can be used in community groups, in women's groups, in adult education, in primary and secondary schools, in universities, to try and prompt conversations, including in the workplace. So I'm very committed myself to just using the book as a tool to have those conversations and to go out. And it doesn't matter to me whether the conversations are with a very small number of people or in packed community halls or lecture theatres, because it's really about changing the nature of the conversation that we have, and a sense that a lot of the conversations about climate change increasingly, I think, they're making people anxious and scared on the one level, and they're actually putting people off on the other level because they just can't connect their everyday lives to it. And I think it's up to us to change the conversation, to bring the issues to people and show them how the changes that will be embedded in their everyday lives will actually improve in the longer term the quality of all our lives, and that we can do it. So the book is serious and it can be depressing at times, but ultimately it's trying to be hopeful in terms of saying, look, hope springs from action, and the book is very much around action, around prompting action, prompting active thinking and conversation. So in that sense, I think it's important that people realise that about the book, that it's written not to be your typical academic book, because it's not. And when you read it, you kind of might be thinking, Jesus, that's a bit odd. How is she getting away with that? It may not be very well cited in the academic metrics, I suspect, and that's fine. I'm quite comfortable with that. I've got over that. The other thing that I found in writing it is that I come from a particular space myself politically. I mentioned anti-poverty and equality, feminism, a class dimension to my work. And in the course of a political life, you make enemies, you take positions, you have your arguments. And I realise myself that I can be part of the problem in all of this, in that I think all of us need to step back a little bit from who we are and where we positioned ourselves in political and academic arguments. And in a way, we need to get over ourselves, and we need to be open to conversing with the wider others who together we need to make this thing happen. So I think it's really important not to be precious and to get over oneself, to admit maybe to being wrong, or to admit that there are other ways of looking at things, and that none of us really have a very coherent one answer to the problem. We're very much in the space of co-creation here, and I think that's okay, but it's a new approach, if you like. And something I've really noticed in relation to young people in particular is the intensity at which young people are feeling the pressure of climate change. I do believe that older activists can bring some experience of activism, that not that activism can be fun, but that it can be more joyous maybe than some of the activism that is being clouded by the anxiety of what people are feeling at the moment. So I do believe that we owe our younger people the leadership and our own experience of organising, whether it's institutional or whatever. As a feminist, I very much think the personal is political, and I have laced through the book a lot of personal anecdotes where I think it's useful to bring learning from my own life. One of my favourite memes is, if I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution, Emma Goldman's, who apparently should never said it at all. It was on a t-shirt, apparently, which is kind of ironic, given consumerism and capitalism created the favourite anti-capitalist, anti-consumerist slogan. But it is that sense of, you know, that we're trying to create a new something, and some of the old frames that we have to understand what might be possible may not be that useful to us. And it is about trying to create new frames, new language, new ways of thinking about it, and trying to imagine a future that we don't actually know what it is, and that it's okay not to know exactly what it is. That all we can do is point the compass in a particular direction and try and identify early steps of travel, because I do believe that the changes we're going to experience with climate and other biodiversity and other issues will be such that we can't really manufacture blueprints to get out of this or to chart our way forward. We can only make it up as we go along, but pointing the first steps in the now, in the very now, is really important. And to some degree, that's what the book tries to do, is, you know, point the direction and address and identifying some foundational steps. I just wanted to say one thing about being in Northern Ireland in terms of the degree to which my own work, I've always, by hook or by crook, kind of ended up working in organisations that were north-south, just, you know, by virtue of what they were. Like the National Organisation of the Unemployed always had UNI, the Organisation of the Unemployed in Northern Ireland, which is gone now, but it's still a 32-county organisation. And on the 16th of November, a group of us who are involved in social security work and anti-poverty work are trying to establish a new network called the All-Ireland Social Security Network, ASIN. But basically what we're trying to do is, believing that we are in a time of change and trying to make sure that issues to do with poverty, welfare, class are actually on the agenda of the change agenda moving forward, that we need to start making ourselves visible and our voices visible and our work visible. So that network has been set up in Green, somewhere in Belfast, on the 16th of November. There's also a feminist research network emerging, and John and I have been talking about an all-island ecosocial sustainable welfare network. I think this is really important. I cannot understand how so little networked spaces have emerged over the last 30, 40 years, north and south, and I really think it's time that we began to think collectively, using the frameworks that we have to do that. So that's just a bit of a backdrop to the book, who I am, what motivates me, and where I'm coming into it. So you saw the video, the other thing I wanted to show off here is the web, okay? And this again is just trying to be innovative in terms of thinking, well, a lot of people are quite visual in how they understand information and see the world. So this was designed, I spent some time in Greenham Common in the 1980s, and I take a lot of inspiration from that, because at the time in Greenham Common, which is about ridding the UK of nuclear missiles, and it was a women's peace camp, effectively, that everybody said we were mad as hatters, we were absolutely barmy, and it could never happen. Over 20 years it happened, they're gone. You know, so I actually do think people, when they really demonstrate people's power, actually can affect quite serious change. So their symbol was a spider's web, and the reason it was a spider's web was to really try and visualize the idea of joining the dots across a number of issues. So I adopted that for the book, and the book's structure, the content and the logic, it's very much about systems thinking and joining the dots across a number of issues. So the yellow bits in that spider relate to part one of the book, which is the why. Why is this a problem? What's going on? And it's saying from problems to solutions. It's trying to identify, okay, what the problem is, as John described it earlier, not only climate change, but also inequality, and very deep inequality. And we need to understand them as part of the same problem and moving towards a solution, which to my mind is a degrowth, a post-growth orientated solution, an ecosocial policy. So having established the why, the book moves then on to the what. Well, what are we talking about? What is ecosocial policy? What would it look like in practice? What point is the compass pointing towards? What are the foundational steps that we would do it in? So within the blue, there are 3 foundational steps outlined. There's enabling institutions in a welfare future. There's the idea of universal basic services, And there's the idea of a type of income support that could complement universal basic services. And in this instance, I've outlined an idea of a kind of conditional basic income as distinct from an unconditional basic income, which I think has got some good things going for it in terms of moving forward. So having established the why and the what, the red, orangey bits, the last 3 chapters look at the how. How do you make change happen? And I suppose, I mean, to my mind, that was the hardest part of the book, because, you know, we can all think why we need to do something, what we want to do, but how you do it is really, really difficult. And you could go at that in a number of ways. Like, you could look at the role of the EU, you could look at elite politics and the political system. Where I choose to, from my own experience, come into the conversation is, I believe none of this will happen without a very significant collective mobilisation from below. So I look at the demand side of what needs to happen. And I do it in 3 ways, looking at the nature of what power is and what inclusive mobilisation would look like. So it's not enough just to mobilise, it needs to be mobilised in a way that would create an equal future, not just a more sustainable future from the point of view of the environment. Because we could create a more sustainable future, but it could be a really bad place for a lot of people to be in. So the idea of inclusive mobilisation at the heart of the political emergence of it happening is really important. The second part of that is around framing, the type of language we're using, the type of way that we put forward our ideas, the need for more institutional imagination and ideas themselves, and a lot of trying to prompt how does change happen, what role does ideas have in it, the role of culture, things like that. And then the last one is about, well, where does that energy from below, if you like, if you can mobilise it, if you can create different types of conversations, where does that meet the political system? And my argument there is that we need a different type of democracy to make the demand side meet the supply side, if you like, in a different way. And I draw particularly on Roberto Ungar's work there with the idea of a high energy democracy, where the political institutions are able to absorb the change-making momentum from society. So political institutions that are very adaptable, mobile, responsive to what society wants from them, rather than being responsive to what elites and the power capital wants from them. So it does require changes in the nature of what democracy is and how it works to move forward with this. And I think they're all really important questions about those kind of things. So that's the joining the dots across 3 very different types of literatures. So we're talking about political economy literature, we're talking about social policy literature, and we're talking about political sociology, and joining the dots across those 3 types of traditions of academic thought as well, which, you know, is very popular to do sometimes. So, you know, now the reason, if you have a look at that slide, and those who are online, just look at it for a minute. And my artwork isn't very good, but I was trying to make it look as if it was all the one thing, but then when you look closer, you can see 2 very different things. And it's welfare, not workfare, and there's no planet B. So it's about 2 protest movements who are side by side and who simply do not overlap or talk to each other. And the aim of the book, in terms of some of the politics in the book, is trying to say, we need to change this situation where both of them are on each other's marches. You know, that the collective mobilisation around inequality and climate change becomes much more organic and inevitable. And some people have said to me in the course of talking about this, they believe that this is beginning to happen. Like there are people at talks that say, well, I go on both of those marches, all my mates do. So there is the germ of it happening, but it's about the scale of that cross mobilisation. So the basic argument of the book in that sense is that, look, you know, the pressure is now so acute that unless we really start joining up the dots across this stuff and really animating a new message that both of these have to move at the same time, that, you know, we're going to miss the opportunity that is in the urgency of now to do it. So the politics have to address both simultaneously, and that would be the core message. And I was just saying to John, even, you know, there is some emerging signs that there are little bits of shifts in thinking around that. There's much more about this now than there was even 2 or 3 years ago. There's signs of those kind of conversations beginning to happen, and one might take hope from that. So the book is called Creating an Ecosocial Welfare Future, okay? And that's very on purpose. It's not called creating an eco-social welfare state, which sometimes I even call it by accident. Because when we think of welfare states, welfare regimes. That's how we're taught, it's how we're framing it. But I really do think that it is more about a welfare future than a welfare state, because the fundamental role and function of the state, particularly in regards to welfare, may change quite dramatically over the next number of years. And I think a lesser role for the market, a bigger role for society, and a different role for the state is sort of how we need to be thinking about it. And the state will become much more a regulator of what needs to happen, not necessarily the provider of those kind of welfare services. So I think in that sense that we need to think quite differently and be very open to much more pluralistic, diverse ways of achieving our welfare, including like food security and things like that, where we become actors in our own lives much more. And I don't mean that in the Cameron big society type of way. I mean it in a new way that we maybe haven't imagined it yet, in terms of recognising our own agency. But I suppose that shifted in terms of, like, we all know beverages 5 evils, but Thompson has identified the 8 giants that are there now. And to some degree, like the 8 giants that he recognises: inequality, economic insecurity, consumer debt, stress, mental illness, precarity, AI, climate, and populism and neo-fascism. To my mind, they're all the same thing. Like, they really are. I do believe that the type of politics that are going on at the moment, to some degree, all of these things are feeding in, and it's very hard to separate out where one starts and the other stops. I was at Naomi Klein the other night in the RDS in Dublin, and we were talking, well, me, like she was talking, the audience was talking about the emergence of the far right, and she said something that I felt was really soundbitey but really effective. She said, look, for a lot of people, the facts may be wrong in terms of what they're believing is true, but their feelings are right. And to some degree, where the left is missing out on is it's not engaging with people's feelings in a way that people feel heard. Whereas the right seem to be able to engage with the feelings, but not the facts, and they make up the facts. But I thought it was really good. So these stressors, the giants that they are, create very strong feelings that people respond to and react to and need reassurance around, and they're not getting it from the present politics of the left. And that's why I think talking about inequality in a much more open way associated with climate change needs to happen, because people are feeling it, and they're responding to it in different ways themselves. So what's wrong with our present welfare system that I'm arguing we need to create a new eco-social welfare future? And I suppose it just goes back to, like, the theory of the welfare state as we know it now, built on a functional role to a large degree in enabling and supporting a capitalist political economy. It's very productivist in nature, particularly working age welfare is increasingly orientated not at decommodifying people, but at commodifying people, at getting them back into the labour market or into the labour market to begin with. And we see things like social investment, for example, new features of welfare policy, very orientated around the workers of the future, training and educating the workers, women's equality and childcare orientated around women's labour market participation, pension ages increasing. A lot of it still very servicing the needs of capital. And so I think the present way that we're orientated around the welfare state is simply not what we need to do in the context of climate inequality and the need to focus less on growth and on productivity and on productivism as the way forward. It's also that the money is in that graph to symbolise that is it's increasingly our worlds, how we get our welfare is increasingly commodified. We buy our welfare more and more from market-based activities. And the future of the welfare that I'm talking about would be where we get our welfare through mechanisms that are not market-based, that are more collective provisioning, where we don't commodify and be so dependent on income to do it. So a lot wrong with present welfare in terms of what we do with there. And if we were trying to identify, well, what would you change? Like, what way would you reorientate the welfare system to try and handle it differently? I can't see that, so I'll just look at that as we have my glasses. Well, one, I think, first of all, recognising that inequality and climate change are both different sides of the same coins, and that whatever you're doing to address one, you're trying to make sure that you're doing it in a way that's compatible with the other. So you're not devising welfare policies that would lead towards negative climate outcomes, and you're not devising climate outcomes that would lead towards greater inequality or poverty or negative welfare outcomes. And that means really looking at things like basic concepts like time, care, money and work, all of which have a present understanding in welfare as we know it, and trying to reimagine the distribution of these things so that they work better for us as a collective humanity. And so time, I think, is really important in terms of, okay, we're configured around a 40-hour week at the moment. Our time is very productivist orientated. We don't have enough time for ourselves, for democracy, for care, for nature. Having less time for those things means that we can't become the active citizens that we need to be to make this change happen. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg going on there. Work, obviously, too productivist, as I've said already, and not enough recognition and valorisation of unpaid work, particularly care. Money, too much of it needing to come through the labour market or through productivist welfare, so a needing for different types of income support. So a basic take that if we reconfigured within the welfare system how we treat those four variables, time, work, money and care, that we would set up different lives, different behaviours, different values that would enable us to be more active agents in our own futures, in our own welfare and in the welfare of the planet as well, in terms of our relationship with nature. That all of that would have to be premised on democratic institutions. So the idea could be, you could do a lot of that, but you could do it in a very autocratic way, in a very paternalistic way, in a very way that would be quite damaging for human agency at the end of the day. So it is really important that the values that you're trying to promote in an active welfare system would come through the process of creating it as well. Now, I don't think this is a very easy area myself, and I think John would be more on top of it than me in terms of political theory, but I think there are massive tensions in trying to design change and design new policies in the context of serious urgency, where you are to some degree trading off time and the luxury, if you like, of the democratic process of co-creation and engagement against the speed at which you need to make this thing happen. There are no easy answers to that in the literature. I would be quite interested in unpacking that a little bit more. And yet I think it's absolutely crucial not to give away that space, which I think a lot of theorists are. They are kind of saying, okay, state of emergency, democracy goes, autocracy's in, got to live with it. Look at COVID, look what happened then. We had to give away our power, let the state do it. I think that's very understandable. But I do think that if we want to get the right solutions that are very sustainable into the long term, that we have to be involved in the creation of them. One thing I've been doing a lot of work with Siobhan O'Donoghue and Uplift is the idea, it comes from American campaigning, and a focus on what they call the brownie and not the recipe. So it's this idea of that we need to change the conversation, particularly about climate change, where people, if we don't have that much time to engage in it, what's really important is that people are very sure of that what they're going to get from the changes are what they want in terms of their lives. So it's the brownie. I want a chocolate brownie. I want one with Smarties on it, whatever. I'm less concerned myself about how you make that brownie or the actual ingredients that go into it, if I can trust the system to deliver it. I'm more concerned I'm going to get what I want at the end of the day. So it's something about what are we using our democracy for? Are we focusing the conversations on enabling people to articulate what they want, what they value, and leave the technocratic kind of things a little bit to the side? Or are we burdening people with very technocratic, recipe-like discussions that we lose them very quickly on? And I think that recipe and brownie, that imagery is quite useful in trying to maybe have a different take on what our democratic institutions need to deliver for us in a quick time frame. That's not in the book, actually. I found that afterwards. But I do think in all of that underpinning all of that is values, okay? And that the values are around reciprocity, around collective freedom, around mutual independence. None of them are new values, but they're all values that have been dissed, if you like. So we're taught now, like the old value of reciprocity has been reconfigured as conditionality, and it's been very narrowed as economic conditionality. And it's about rescuing some of the normative ideas of our mutual interdependence and our orientation to be natural enablers and carers of each other, and celebrating that and welcoming it back and trying to build on it. The idea of liberal individual freedom has been pushed on us hugely. It's about not dissing away the importance of freedom, but saying, what about collective freedom? What about the collective freedom to create the world that we want? Isn't that more important than the individual right to do what I want to do right this minute? And having those kind of conversations. So it's not, it's like the values are in there somewhere, the language is there, but it's about trying to reframe how we think about them and what we talk about. I'm not going to dwell on that, but just that people said, I said the book isn't theoretical, and it's not, but it does come from a deeper theoretical base. So there is, in the backdrop of it, capability theory, drawing upon both Sen and Nussbaum. There is theory around needs, drawn on Goff and Doyle particularly, and there's a lot of feminist theory on care underpinning some of the notions in the book. So none of the stuff came out of nowhere, if you like, and it's referenced in the book, but the book isn't really trying to make a big deal of it. It's trying to sort of say, look, if you want to go read that stuff, do. It's there, and it references it. But it doesn't try and sorry about that. So the blue bit of the book we're moving into now, it's saying that, like, okay, so what do we want to do? And I mentioned earlier on that we're not in the blueprint territory here. You cannot blueprint a welfare state or a welfare future for 20 years' time or even 10 years' time. We just don't know what the world will be like. We don't know what our needs will be. But this here represents seeds, okay? It's a picture of seeds. And it's about saying, okay, there is actually, and this might be controversial to say it, but there are some good things in the welfare system, okay? We didn't spend 50, 60 years making this system for it to be absolutely crap. It was, you know, great at some stage, still is. There's universal payments in some payments. There are some good enabling institutions. There's community development, there's adult education. There's some good active labour market measures. There are care-related payments where you're socially valued care work, and there are some unconditional payments. There's social supports that meet needs, and there is increasing individualisation. So to some degree, I think this makes the politics of trying to create a welfare future more feasible, because to some degree, you can build on some of the seeds of the present to grow the future that you might want to do. And that's really important in the politics of making it happen, because you're rarely closing down the system and opening up a new one. Most of it will be the non-reformist reforms that Olin White talks about. So basically what I'm talking about in terms of trying to reimagine a welfare future is to build on it from the seeds of the present, and particularly to focus on three apexes. The nature of the institutions that we have, making sure they're enabling, the nature of the services we have, making sure that they're universal and up to function, and the nature of the income supports that we have. So the chapter 4 talks about enabling institutions. And that's going back to those values, saying, okay, if we think values like reciprocity, interdependence are important, how do you embed those type of values in your institutions? How do you develop education systems, active labour market measures, community development programs that enable those values to become real in people's lives? And I think you can do it, and I point towards that a lot of those institutions would have to be local, because people's lives are local, and the institutions that they depend on most to live their lives are local. Gender equality would have to be really at the centre and care of those institutions. Things like collaborative governance, co-creation, the process of how policies are made and implemented in those institutions are really important. And adequacy is really important. And we all know that a lot of the time people start off designing relatively okay institutions, but they just don't fund them well enough for them to be able to do what they need to do. So adequate institutions is important there. And as I said, you know, the germs of some of them do exist, and we can build on the good practice that we have. So that's one set of the corner of the second area is the universal basic services, and I'm particularly drawing on Anna Coote's work here. So basically what she says is no matter what kind of service you're looking at, be it say transport or education or housing or health or care, childcare, adult care, that really what you need to try and think of is a way of delivering a universal service that everybody can access. But you don't need to deliver it in the same way to everybody, and not everybody needs to access it in the same way. So she talks about that plurality and diversity of the provision of those services. And as long as everybody has the right to access a service, it's less important who delivers it in that local area. It could be a market, it could be a not-for-profit, it could be the state, it could be a self-driven local enterprise. Like there's a load of ways of delivering it. The more important thing is that for it to work, that the state needs to be the leader. So it's not that the state needs to be the provider, but the state needs to regulate that the service would happen. It needs to fund the service to happen. It needs to monitor that the services happened, and it needs to plan what number of services are needed. So the role of the state changes quite a bit to how we understand what the role of the state is right now. And the role of the state, particularly as the planner. So if you think of childcare, you know, the state isn't really doing that right now. It's not looking at, okay, we've got X number of needs out there, we need a number of services, they need to be spread regionally, locally, and this is what we need, this is how we need to regulate it, this is how we can fund it and put it out there, and it can be delivered then in a number of ways. Transport, the same way. The planning of it is really important. So it goes back to the idea of a big state and maybe what we would have seen as in a lot of the theory of the social state as the planning state, if you like, but the role of planning is much more embedded in the provision of welfare. And I give an example in the book of how that might look like in terms of care policy in the south of Ireland. And I kind of argue this isn't mental, like it actually, we can see it inching out in practice where the state is regulating more, is funding more, is planning more, and is monitoring more. So we can actually see it being made real. And if we're looking at, say, something like if we were to really crack carbon emissions in relation to public transport, say, this is what we have to do. We have to have free public transport accessible to all, overseen by a very active state and delivered by a very, very wide range of actors. So it's trying to get real about what that might look like in the future in terms of going on. And I have this here because I love this sign, the future is public. I really believe in this because it's not about that the future is state. The future is public in terms of publicly owned. We are the future and we should own our future. So this is comes from Andrew Cumbers in Glasgow, who has documented nearly 2,000 instances where there was privatisation of services, from nursing homes to graveyards to electricity pylons to childcare, a very, very wide range of services being privatised across the world. He's documented over 2,000 of those being overturned and brought back into public ownership. Now, whether that was the provision of electricity in Berlin, down to nursing homes in Oslo, and water in Bolivia, like the examples are very wide ranging. But what they show is that just because something has happened in the past doesn't mean it has to be that way in the future, and that you can reverse some of these things. And that quite a lot of the time, the reversals were prompted by the failure of the privatisation to deliver what people needed at the end of the day. And it was often the local municipality who took back the service from the failing provision by the private actor. This slide comes from a remunicipalisation is the process that they use to talk about it. So it's remunicipalisation, putting things back into public ownership at a local level. But Andrew Cumbers talks about a much wider vision of public ownership being community ownership, commoning, community wealth management, you know, the wide range of diverse ways, social licensing, lots and lots of ideas of how you can deliver things differently, not led by the market and not particularly led by the state, but regulated by the state and trained by the state. So I think that's really important in terms of what the future could look like. The third bit of that future, in terms of the what, is the idea of what kind of money people would need. So the idea would be that if you have enabling institutions and you have universal basic services, that people could get a lot of what they need from A, their own resources, and B, the collective provisioning of their needs. So the function of money is lessened somewhat, but not totally done away with by any measure of means. Of course, there would still be markets. There's no argument about getting rid of markets completely. We all love them. You know what I mean? Like that they are part of our culture and our lives. So things like your clothes, maybe your basic food stuff, you're still going to buy, and the diversity of provision is probably best delivered through some market system. So there's an argument for money and for income support, but that it will be delivered not through the welfare payments that we know of at the moment, which are increasingly making us be very narrow economic actors in return for the welfare payments. The idea would be that you would replace the present welfare system with something that would be much more universal in terms of that everybody would have access to the income, and that it would be conditional in terms of it would embed the value of reciprocity in terms of everybody would have to do something that is of social value, not necessarily work for paid employment or prove that you're looking for a job type thing. Could be care, could be democratic activity, could be ecological activity, could be cultural activity. But the idea would be that, you know, that the income allows us to be the people that we need to be, live the lives that we want to live, and enable us towards that collective future together. So the idea of a participation income as a conditional basic income, it's out there in the literature since about 1995. Tony Atkinson brought it out first. It's been heavily critiqued in the literature by the basic income advocates who have a right go at it. So I have a right go back in the book in terms of just trying to say, I believe that a lot of the arguments that there are against doing something like this are quite theoretical, but that in practice it can work quite well. And I don't care about the theory at all. I care about what might work. So I think that having an income that's conditional can help us define social value and get the things, the behaviours we want. So if we want to value care, rewarding people for doing care work seems to me to make a lot of common sense, not rewarding them for doing nothing or rewarding them for doing anything they want to do. I believe in the push bit of it. It helps with promoting reciprocity. It can be practical in terms of people can be empowered through the process of identifying their entitlement to the payment, what kind of participation that they feel. So if it's culture, if it's democracy, if it's environmental activity, if it's care, if it's community development, I do believe that we would need a system where people would have the agency and the power to define their own terms of engagement, but that they would be quite wide and potentially most people would be able to do it. I think there's always a debate about whether you target income or whether you make it universal. And look, there's a picture there of us with this report that I'll talk to in a minute, just about targeting versus universal, because it is a thorny question when you don't have enough resources. If you make it universal, the danger is that you make it lower in terms of its adequacy in order to spread it around more people, and that you can bite off your nose to spite your face. But the other issues are that anything that promotes value in care is going to open up gender equality, and that there are issues around institutional capacity and political feasibility to think about. But I do believe that this kind of income is more politically feasible and more likely to happen than a universal basic income. And in terms of the trade, like if you're setting up the future, the big argument is that it would be about universal basic income. I think it's worth looking at this maybe as a stepping stone to something in the future. Who knows what it could be in the future? I'm not saying don't do universal basic income, I'm just saying I think right now we're miles away from it, and this seems to be a lot nearer. And this picture here was me and a few other people in the Irish Parliament in the summer. And we're going back in on the 11th of October, next Wednesday, okay, to the Oireachtas Committee on Social Protection. And we're arguing for a participation income for family care. And we've actually taken the theory of this and mapped out what is an actual policy proposal to change carers allowance in Ireland to a universal conditional income support for doing family care. We've costed it, and it's given us a really good insight into targeting versus universality. Because what we costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office was, say if you change the means test, you want to get rid of means testing, right, generally speaking. So we thought about, okay, we make it an income test, and we don't want really rich people to get this. politically it's not that feasible. And anyway, we don't like really rich people, so we don't want to give them money. So we kind of thought, right, anybody over 100 grand doesn't get this payment. And we costed what that would take. And then we made a separate thing and said, okay, we'll give it to everybody. And we costed that. There was only 10 million euro in the difference between giving it to everybody was 390 million, and giving it to everybody under 100 grand was 380 million. Now, when we sat down, and we were shocked, but when we sat down and thought about it, we realised rich people don't do care. So none of the rich people would have qualified for the family care because they buy care when they need care. They don't do it themselves. So they would never satisfy the conditional bit, so they weren't getting the payment. And then we went, of course, yeah, that made sense. So it meant that we could offer a universal payment with no means testing, but only make it available to people who did the condition, which was the care work or the cultural work or whatever. So that's the example of care. That, and this is getting traction. I mean, we were asked into the Social Protection Committee. We didn't even write and ask them to invite us. They said we were knocking on an open door. They were looking for ideas, and we would come in. And some of you might know about the Artist Basic Income Pilot. Same concept. It's a universal payment. It's given to you regardless of how much money you have, on condition you're doing the work. And the work in this instance is cultural work. And okay, it's only a pilot, but the principle of the idea is the exact same. It's a conditional basic income. It's giving you a basic income on condition you fulfill a certain behaviour. Okay, so it's not mad, is what I'm saying to you. It's there, the seeds are there, and it's about growing those seeds quickly, admittedly. So I do think I brought a couple of copies of that report, just but like, so these are like all the ideas in the book. I believe are things that we can traction and that we can get moving on, and that's kind of happening in the next couple of weeks, which is kind of exciting. The last bit of the book talks to the how. Okay. And I'm going to speed up a bit just on this bit, just to let you in. And as I said at the beginning, I mean, the how could have talked about how does change happen through elite power? What is the role of political parties in translating things into theory? What's the role of the European Union? And I didn't go into those spaces primarily because I don't study those spaces myself, but also because I believe when you're talking about transformational change, that it doesn't happen through these systems unless there is serious demand from below first. So that if the demand from below isn't there, none of these elite power spaces will translate anything into transformational change, at least positive transformational change. So I talked more about theories of change and theories of action that enable power from below to be mobilised and to augment and increase, and particularly focused on mobilisation and inclusive participation, because I do believe that's really important. The nothing about us without us kind of mantra, but I think, I mean, what we already see in the climate change movement, if you like, is that it is quite stereotypically middle class. It's very white. It's not taking forward the agendas of care and inequality and poverty in its framing of the issues, and it's not bringing people with us. And we can see the politics of climate change responding to that. I mean, the Gilets jaunes in France, people were horrified when they saw them all, but like, you know, it was kind of understandable in a way because policies had been enacted that totally ignored the reality of their lives, and they were kind of saying, look, you're doing this without us, stop it. You know, if you look, so if we don't do it with people, we won't bring people with us either. I mean, there's another thing. So one chapter looks at that and talks about that. The next one looks at the need for political and institutional imagination and looks at the power of ideas in being really important in enabling change to happen. And talks about, I really like this framework of Ready Now. I don't know if anybody came across it. You might have. Frances Perkins was the first female Secretary of State in the American Roosevelt administration after the Great Depression. So they were bringing in the New Deal. Okay, and Frances Perkins, but more or less wrote the New Deal, and she had it written and ready for when it was needed. And her mantra was ready now. I just love it. So she's basically saying, if you don't have something ready when the moment comes, you're not going to get it in. It's not rocket science. So she's kind of saying, it's really important to have these few basic ideas ready and in the pot. So when somebody says, what will we do? You say this, right? You don't have a total answer. You don't have a global plan. You just have this piece of legislation, change the social security system that way, labour law that way. You know some changes that you need to ask. And that's where that Ready Now slogan comes from. It was a big slogan in the 1930s in America. And that framing narrative is part of that. So you have the ideas ready, but also you have the frame, how you talk about the problem, how you understand the problem is really important in convincing people that that's the solution that's needed to address that particular problem. So framing climate as a problem of inequality is absolutely essential if the solution is to include solutions to inequality. And then the last chapter looks at that kind of structure and agency issue that is there at the heart of all social and political theory. And it's the idea that, okay, the power of capital, it's there. That's not to press ourselves too much about it, but it's extremely strong and it has the potential to get in the way of any kind of transformational change that we want to happen. So in terms of being real about it, how can you really expect democracy and the power of mobilisation to really take on the power of global capital? I mean, is this really pie in the sky stuff? And you might say, yes, it is pie in the sky stuff. Or you might say, well, look, change has happened throughout all our lives. Sometimes happens when we least expected it. And it usually happens because of very significant mobilisation from below. And at some tipping point, the power of capital gets overturned. And it just does. And sometimes they recognise that and they get behind the change agenda too. So that thing that I said earlier on is, you won't achieve a momentum of power unless you get the combined effort of society and the democratic institutions that are kind of delivered by the state working in tandem with each other. They need to be strong enough to be a balance of power against the power of capital. And that kind of idea of the high energy democracy is sort of speaking to that, the need to develop institutions of democracy that enable more powerful societies to speak to the market, to control the market. And then that agency idea is really around saying the climate change agenda at the moment is too narrowly understood to be the privilege and the preserve of environmentalists. And then you have trade unionists, and then you have feminists, and then you have youth groups, and then you have Catholics, and then you have Protestants. You have very, very siloed civil society, all doing their own special thing and all advancing their own particular interest. And I think that is really deeply problematic. To some degree, it's a product of state policy. They have divided us in order to rule us, but we have fallen into the trap of being divided. And I do think that coalition and joining the dots, going back to just going back to the spider's web at the beginning, that's really important. And I would say to John, like, I'm going down in the morning to a meeting where literally we're trying to join the dots a little bit around bringing interest groups together that don't normally sit in the same room and trying to have a conversation, because like we really are insignificant when we are not joining up. And I think history again shows us collective organisations are very good there. So I wouldn't like you to think that the book has a lot of answers or is parsimonious in terms of what it's trying to do. I mentioned, if I can't answer, I don't want to be in your revolution. Another of my favourite sayings, and it's Zhezong, the Chinese, it's not a hero of mine, but I love the expression. It talks about crossing the river by feeling the stones, okay? And it is the sense of that we can only make this up as we go along to some degree, both in terms of the policy agenda, but also in terms of the politics of getting there. It's not that there are answers, it's that we have to help each other to get there. So this is sort of like the idea of that we can really help each other by crossing the stones one by one until we get to the other side. It was the Chinese leader who was in charge of the Cultural Revolution. And he said that the Cultural Revolution, although there was a lot of state planning, that actually even in China, they were only doing it one step at a time and crossing the river by stepping the stones. So not a good person to quote, but the image is very good. So I do think that that's important, though, in terms of that sense of when you enter conversations, when you're trying to join the dots, it's not that you think you know everything and you're trying to win over the other side to what you believe. It's going into a place and saying, look, this is bloody urgent. We have to work together on this. And we have to share our collective understandings and make new understandings, and we have to be in that frame of mind to do it. That requires a lot of leadership, and I do think that leadership is really needed now in civil society and in the different sectors that we have. So this is the last slide, which is further reading in good academic sense, but it's just reminding people that I suppose I devised that back in 2017 before COVID, when I was trying to work out in my own head this kind of idea, and I called it a facilitated state enabling an active society, because I was trying to get at, you know, what's the nature of the state that we're talking about, and we're recognising that tax would have to be a big part of the story, and wealth tax in particular, and then those ingredients of participation income and using universal basic services. But I have care in the middle, and I suppose what I'm trying to get at there is that replaces growth as it's a care-centric society, care of ourselves and care of nature, and it replaces growth as our reason for being kind of thing, and that it turns our heads in that type of way. So to leave it with that just as the image in terms of care being the central well-being, our own well-being, the planet's well-being, being what we need to work towards rather than growth. So I leave it at that at 7, so that's kind of on time with it. Yeah.
Oh, well, a lot to take on board, so definitely encourage everybody to go and read the book. I'm not going to monopolise quite yet my chair's privilege and asking questions, but and for folk online, if you want to just put your comments in the chat, for those in the room, and if you'd like to, you can ask a question or comments.
So I forgot my notebooks with a ton in here. I'm trying to formulate it into a question. So much of it really resonated with me and a lot of the research I've done. I guess one of the kind of high level in the sense that it is quite a theoretical question, but something you've talked about the need for sort of the democratic element of it and inclusive movements. But it feels like at the center of this really is changing the nature of the state. And you talked about towards the end about the balance of power between social movements and working with the democratic institutions of the state as we have it against the power of capital. But to me, it feels like the extent to which the liberal democratic state that we do have has co-evolved with capital means that I think the balance of power will ultimately always go in capital's favour when the state's in the equation. And I think you can see that from the increased sort of state repression of social movements of the likes of Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil in the climate sphere particularly. And I think that is because they do represent a threat to capital, and even the extent maybe to which we can replace growth as a sort of core function of the state, which I would love to see if care takes on that sort of primary spot. But in doing so, I think you ultimately bring people into a place of antagonism with the power of capital, which will try to reassert itself. So I know there's not really a question in there, but I'm just wondering maybe, with that, as we reflect on what are the kind of movements we need then? Are they the movements that we have? Are they kind of protest movements, or do they maybe need to step into a more radical sphere? Is that anything you've thought about?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really good question and sobering, in the sense of getting at the heart of the how, and is that change really possible? I have to admit, when I was writing the book, I was probably in the glow of the 2018 referendum on repeal, and I was really in a positive frame of mind myself about change is possible. And after 40 years as a feminist fighting for reproductive rights in the South, to be part of a transformational moment was really enabling for me to think through. But also, I mentioned earlier, that the experience of Greenham, apartheid, Berlin Wall, so some of those big structural changes that happen in the world that do feel like they won't happen at all, and then that do happen, and that you can take some hope and faith from. But I suppose I would be, in terms of theory, I would be quite inspired by planning and that idea of that inevitably society will respond to pain and to the market not servicing its needs. But the nature of the response from society can not necessarily lead to positive change. So he gives the example of in the States it led to the New Deal and a kind of social democracy type thing, but in Europe it led to fascism. You know, and both were responding to the same set of conditions, if you like, for society. So I would be very mindful of that you know, that what we're setting into is so uncharted in that sense. And I understand the tensions that we have at the moment in the world as that very space opening up again, where the world could go in one direction and maybe the degrowth symbolises that direction, or it could go in a quite populist fascist kind of direction. And we see that, you know, particularly if you're in Central Europe, I think you see that much more urgently and painfully than you do from the British Isle kind of perspective. We're a little bit inured from it, I think. It's a different type of populist kind of dynamic that's happening here, but it's really real and violent in some of the countries. I suppose, I think when we're looking at the nature of the social movements and that, I would take some of it from the likes of Klein and Rebecca Solnit and that, who talk about we need something that captures the energy of the new power, the horizontal kind of power movements like Extinction Rebellion or the Me Too movement and stuff like that, who clearly have ways of being and mobilising and enabling participation that old movements don't. But we need to bring with us some of the lessons from the old movements about how do you institutionalise those kind of movements, how do you get them nearer to the policy system in terms of being able to translate anger into demands that are very solid. And I think sometimes that can be done. I remember when, don't know if any of you remember in Ireland, in Dublin, there was the occupation of Apollo House by Glenn Hansard and a few musicians. And it was very organic, it was a very social movement in its orientation. And when the state eventually went to kind of begin to negotiate and say, right, I've got to figure that out. Like, what was really interesting is that there was no demands. There was anger and there was rhetoric and stuff, but the more institutional housing organisations had to come in then and work with the Apollo House activists to chart a set of demands that then could be negotiated. And it was just a good example of you need both. You really need both, and you need both to not get in each other's way, but to actually work together. I think one of the things that I find useful there is Eric Alwyn's Wright's idea of that, you know, transformational change. We can do it in three different ways: through revolutionary tactics, through anarchist kind of tactics, or through reformist social democratic tactics. And what I took from him the most was that, you know, in a way, the problem is sometimes those three groups all get in each other's way and fight with each other all the time, and they forget they have a common enemy in capital, or even in the nature of the state, as it might be in alignment with capital. And he looks for the individual movements to try and better understand their way of understanding change and how they relate to other actors who also want a transformational change and are pointing in the same direction as them. I think there's a lot we need to do as a society to increase our capacity to do that. Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, the power of capital is immeasurable, you know what I mean? But I just remain convinced that if we don't find, like, I suppose I'm not an optimist, okay? But my hope comes from just being in the thick of it and trying to sort of see that people really want this to happen, and that there enough of us want it, that we get the critical mass someday, and that change does happen. And it has to happen because we blow ourselves up otherwise. Do you know what I mean? That even the capitalists will, even they must realise at some stage the game is up, and that they need to, and if we're not there with our articulation of what the future should look like, even when they realise the game is up, it may be autocracy that they turn to rather than a solid set of a more sustainable life for everybody. So I think something will happen, but it's the what will happen that we need to determine. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Do you mind if I respond really quickly? Again, just to say, I don't feel like I have any neat answer to that. It's just something that I've been trying to tackle in my own work, and a lot of what you said resonates as well. The taking Eric Owen Wright's approach, and even your use of the non-reformist reforms sort of idea, and universal basic income, and just that coalition building, and even the care element as well. I think it's maybe working with the institutions we do, but kind of building outside those as well, to realise that there will be struggle in the future. And I think part of that is preparing for that. It is creating these certain institutions of care and these caring relations that when that does inevitably happen, you have something to kind of step into.
Yeah, because change is inevitable. It really is. And Rebecca Solomon says that very, very clearly. Like the future will change, but we need to make sure it changes in a particular direction. And that's our job. It's not to make the change will happen, but we need to be there to make the change be the one that we want it to be.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi.
That's brilliant. I just want to make one point. The way you're sort of saying about the Irish and getting the basic income. I just want to say that's really working because I know many Irish small houses who benefit greatly and in relation to mental health and everything else. It just gives them that fullness for they can actually make ends meet. Carers as well, I think it's such a fantastic idea because in relation to potentially most important issue that I'm kind of working with in this being inequality, and most carers are female, and they're finding it incredibly hard because not only are they carers, they're also mothers, and there's also a lot of other responsibilities, and therefore they have to do 2-3 jobs as well as be carers to make ends meet. So I think it's not only a great idea, I think it's a practical idea. And my question to you is more in relation to climate change. The fact that in relation to female equality, these laws that are being implemented to force the general public to act in relation to promote the female equality, the same can't be said for climate change. And I was just wondering, do you think that the government needs to enforce more rules and regulations where people are held responsible for their actions in relation to climate change and sustainability?
I'm not adverse to it, as in, like, I mean, you saw there, I mean, I'm into conditional basic income, so I believe that policies can be necessary in order to prompt behaviour, and that, you know, we informally and formally, our culture prompts certain behaviours, so I believe that they're there anyway to some degree. So I don't want, where I suppose what would make me nervous around the edges of it is that tendency not to bring people with you, in terms of it can be too easy sometimes to be quite autocratic and say, look, if you got to do this and you're doing it now, end of, we're not explaining why, we're just making you all do it. And I think if you look at some of the stuff around agriculture particularly, like, you see very little attempt really to use democratic processes, even in the turf kind of stuff, or even in the water kind of stuff that was going on. There could have been much more of education, of bringing people with you, of having democratic debate and trying to orientate people towards changes rather than just coming in and saying, right, this is what we're doing, climate needs it, EU directive said blah, we're doing it. And that doesn't get you the change you need to do. So either for moral reasons or just practical instrumental reasons, then I think you're better to bring people with you than to go in first with the big finger and the big rule kind of thing. I suppose COVID gave us some insight into states that would lay down things very quickly in a state of emergency, and maybe what it might be like as things get more intense around climate change. And some of that will be inevitable, I think, you know, but I do think that the more we bring people with us, I mean, Colin mentioned conflict with capital, but actually I think some of the conflict that we're going to really experience is conflicts between ourselves as society as well. And that scares the living daylights out of me, because that's the real dystopia. I mean, I expect conflict with capital, but I find it really difficult to have conflict within humanity. But when people are scared and resources are scarce, and we're in a place of unknowing, then I think we've got raw ingredients for serious conflict, and we're beginning to see what that looks like.
Yeah.
So, you know, and racism and anti-migration and all the rest of it becomes very easy.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Anthony. Just to say, I'm not academic myself anyway at the trade union. The reason why I say that is because I operate in my own trade union side up, so I simply agree that with what they say. So for most people we have the union, but I've heard this so many times now. A more pluralistic state, we just want to take it back now because then we've got members, we can make it away from, etc. That would sort of be the official union line, but for myself, I've gone through the own intellectual maturity over the last few years back against the next week, but I've sort of developed a lot more understanding on that. But the reason why I say that is because I don't tend to, or wouldn't tend to, participate in the green movement as such. I've been to a couple of these meetings, and what I found is that you get a lot of stats and everything bad or die, etc. And you know, right in that sense, but I particularly like how you frame this debate, because the idea of reimagining welfare, making it personal, making it feeling driven, that's something that anyone can relate to. Certainly the people that I deal with every day in terms of numbers, they will relate to that. And my question really, because I don't just want to make a comment, I want to ask a question. What's the sort of green movement's position on this way of framing it? Are they in favour of it? Because I'm not anti-green by any stretch of the imagination, it's just how far we've been very good as an experience. I've been active on the left for the past 10 years or so, but it is dominated by sort of, I don't know, sort of middle class and that. I'm not against that, but it's just we need to get more people involved by that. And I think this way of framing the faces, for me, that would resonate a lot more. It's probably the most articulate frame of the debate I've heard. So thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for your question, which is quite a nasty question, really. A difficult question. No, I mean, first of all, just to say, I suppose the trade union movement, there is some really good stuff happening in the European trade union movement, like the Congress at a European level, which is beginning to percolate down, I think, into national union movements. There's ETUI, which is the European Trade Union Institute, are doing a lot of work on, they're in that ecosocial space, they're in a degrowth space, they're in conditional basic income space, and they actually are pushing out the agenda quite a lot. The ETUC spoke at the degrowth conference in the European Union recently, and you know, it was a hard line for them to kind of pivot in a way, because they were trying to show leadership around growth and being on a degrowth side, but they were also trying to insist on just transition for workers and issues around job loss and compensation. So it's not straightforward, like when you do try and get those interests going, but I did really genuinely think that they were in a good space and that they were doing good stuff. So I think they probably have come nearer the green agenda than possibly the green agenda have come into their space, to be frank. But the green agenda is very wide as well. I mean, it is a very, very pluralistic agenda in itself as well. So even within, say, a green space like the growth space or the degrowth space, you've got massive arguments between anarchist degrowthers, socialist degrowthers, communist degrowthers, and capitalist degrowthers, which there are some which are not sure how to get their heads around it. But so I do think that within the green movement, these debates are happening, and some of those conversations are happening. But they need to be. There needs to be a moment when we all climb out of our bunkers and have the cross conversations. And I do hope it is coming in the broad sense. But I do think that the trade union movement, like if you look at some of the work that the unions are part of in the South around through the National Economic and Social Council, they are framing just transition, like they did do quite a bit to bring the just transition language and that framing in, which is bringing an equality agenda into the climate thing quite usefully. Now that language is quite nebulous, and it can be owned by the strongest capitalist and the strongest socialist, so it's very hard to take some of the language credibly, but I think there are people using just transition as a frame that are really trying hard to use it usefully and to get it into that space. And in a way, we just all need to be very, like, languages, I mean, gender equality as a frame can be used by, you know, I mean, has been used by the most neoliberal woman in the world to, you know, to very far left kind of understandings of gender equality. And all these frames are, so you just need to be politic with engaging with them and trying to use them.
Could I just follow up on that? Because for me, Mary, your book, that was my reading of it as well. This is a kind of the base of a working class environmentalism, which you've been struggling to create, I think, for decades. The green movement is often very scientific, it comes across as technocratic, never mind the guilty, educated middle classes. And your book, I think, for those who are interested, good companion books would be a guy called Matthew Huber, called Climate Change is Class War, which came out last year, and a fantastic book by a sociologist, I think in Bristol, called Karen Bell, called Working Class Environmentalism. And what both of them do is, in a way, the way you do, Mary, they tackle the way in which many working class people view the environmental movement, not just as a religious class, talking about electric cars and solar panels that they can't afford. But this language of scarcity, there's a problem with it. I don't like using the term degrowth, because what we need is a politics of abundance, a politics of pleasure and sensuality and welfare. So I think the language you're using is a much more appealing language to bring in, I think, ordinary people who are concerned with climate. Working class people are wrongly viewed as not as seeing this as something else. So I just wanted to absolutely agree with what's being said in terms of the articulation of this, of moving into a different space. And it's interesting that just tomorrow, ask Mary this question tomorrow evening, and just have an engagement with some of the environmental groups down themselves. So I don't know whether that's part of your exclusive motivation, so we're going to formulate this as a question of creating a working class environmentalism. Was that part of your thinking?
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose if you look at the space that I come from, which would be kind of social policy, anti-poverty, equality, some of the motivation in writing the book came out of my own lack, if you like, in terms of a consciousness that I was leaving climate to the others.
Yeah.
And yet I knew it was the most fundamental issue of our time, and the rest of the stuff was, you know, like if we weren't bringing climate into the inequality agenda, that we weren't having a proper conversation. So some of it was my own need to break free of myself and my own narrow framing that I wanted to do it. But some of it, yeah, was seeing maybe that, that the experience of trying to get some of the issues on the agenda politically and them not getting any traction. And you could see why. You could see because they were getting pushed back very, very quickly because they weren't being framed right and they weren't being framed usefully. So but there is a lot of change there. I think like there's the National Women's Council and Community Work Ireland just recently established a thing called Feminist Communities for Climate Change or for Climate Action, which is great, and it really is talking the pension and pence kind of stuff. And I'm trying to get in and underneath it. So I do think that there is much more, like there's a collective penny dropping going on, I hope, where people are beginning to say, no, we really need to talk about this. With Siobhan O'Donoghue, I spent a bit of time in Kerry. We just picked Kerry for a reason, and we called this project Changing the Conversation about climate change. And we were like two twats now. We just stood in Tralee Town Square and on the junctions outside of a few shopping centres in small towns around Kerry, and we just stopped people, like just literally anybody walking by who would, and we said to them, we're not looking for money, we're not mad, you know, and come here, you got 5 minutes because we want to talk to you about climate change. And we had a couple of prompt questions, but what we wanted to do was just see what people said. If you said, I want to talk to you about climate change, like we didn't really have an agenda, and it was amazing. People talked about health, they talked about pollution, they talked about transport a lot. And they immediately translated it into their own lives very, very quickly. And we realised they were talking a completely different set of issues than what the Green Movement were talking, because they were, and a lot of them cared deeply, and they considered themselves climate activists and climate warriors and stuff like that. But how they expressed it as being relevant in their lives wasn't being picked up in the conversations that you hear and that was really useful. And that's where we did the brownie recipe thing, because we realized people talked about brownies, they didn't talk about recipes. Like, you know, if you started saying, well, how do you think you could do that? They were, just do it, you know, just don't annoy me, you know, kind of thing. Or I haven't got time to be getting into this, you know, but I do want it. So I do think that, yeah, hopefully that we can. In terms of working class environmentalism, I suppose I would have come into it myself in terms of just seeing it, not so much working class, more agricultural class maybe, but the working, like around the turf movement, my own family would have an agricultural background. So I would have been in on a lot of conversations with turf cutters, I suppose, whose frustration was being told what to do by the state with no democracy, and just listening to some of those conversations and kind of realising, geez, there's something going badly wrong here, because these people are decent people. These people are smart people, but they're not being treated with respect, and therefore we're not getting the engagement that we need. And realising actually if that's happening all over the place, then we're not going to be able to make the changes that we need to make, because we're not going about it in the right way. I think you can pick that up with agriculture transition more broadly anyway, but with the turf, like water was another example as well, I guess, in the south, that we had the big water charge debate, where the issues of poverty and inequality and capacity to pay really didn't get any traction, because it became very polarised yes and no, and we didn't manage to have the conversation, which was, well, maybe there is an environmental angle on this, but yes, there's also a poverty and inequality angle. So how do we get a better policy dynamic going between the two? We didn't have that conversation because it became very polarised very quickly. Well, I always thought there was a third way there, probably, that you could have had a different conversation if you framed it differently.
I think you're absolutely right. It's probably for a separate conversation with the most difficult part of the just transition on this island would be in agriculture, just given the disproportionate, impact of the greenhouse gas profile. But I couldn't help but be reminded, you mentioned the Gilets Jaunes movement, and there's a great phrase during that movement, which was, it's hard to think about the end of the world when you can't think about the end of the week. Of bringing together those issues of, income, inequality and precarious work and all the rest of it with the climate crisis. I've loads of other things I could say, but I want to say, does anybody online or anybody else?
I haven't had any questions, just lots of praise.
But maybe then I could ask a little bit more of a, not quite a controversial question, but a lead up to it. It's about, how is this possible while we're part of the European Union? That's where I'm going to get to. Because I do think that if you write the second edition of the book, Mary, I think you've got allies in modern monetary theory, which is the wrong name for it. It's simply a functional account of how the modern state works. For those who don't know it, we can blame Margaret Thatcher and handbag economics. Most of us, because we all have to get money to spend it, think that's how the state works. So tax, we got tax first, and then we can spend it. That's crap. That's not how state finances work. The state spends the money into existence. Tax is there for equality reasons and so on. So the state is not a household, is essentially the analogy. Now, I know it's very counterintuitive, but there's lots of evidence to show. And in fact, the Bank of England, about 7 years ago, finally fessed up in a document they released that's it. The state does not need to tax, it simply creates the money. But if you think about it, how can a state run out of something that it itself creates? And where this goes is the classic kind of Marxist view of the economy, that the only thing we should be concerned with are the actual assets, land, people, plant, machinery. The money can come. Now, this is to me it's quite Damascus when I came across it a few years ago, because I was, what do you mean? The state doesn't need to raise taxes to spend. And what it means, though, Mary, is that a lot of the fiscal constraints and all those budget constraints we can't spend on this is actually the reproduction of a neoliberal scarcity mentality, which means we can't have nice things. Do you think the British government, in the depth of the Second World War, Churchill was worrying, how are we going to raise the taxes to create the weapons to fight the Nazis? You know, so in other words, there was I think, an unacknowledged ally in a new understanding of state finances, which can help and can fund this transition. Why is there always money for war and not for the NHS? But where they're going though is that's an ally, and I think definitely you will find a lot of support for your arguments. But it seems to me that the European Union, for which I've now fallen out of love with in the last couple of years, is constitutionally neoliberal. And it would seem that any state that would try to go in the direction you described here, as we've seen in the wake of the financial crisis, where the pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, were absolutely hammered by the institution of the European Union. So I'm giving you, on the one hand, the sugar, the modern monetary theory and the view of the functional view of state finances, and then the medicine. Do you think we would have to leave the European Union? That's one option. Or the European Union itself have to be absolutely radically changed to enable this to happen. So one's a more strategic question in terms of, is part of the analysis here that we have to start thinking about leaving the European Union or radically changing how that can happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I was just looking through the book there when you were talking because I was trying to find something in it, but I couldn't find it. But the modern monetary theory that you speak to, the book does discuss the role of quantitative easing, which I think is in the space that you're in there, and it very clearly says, look, I mean, you can magic money. I mean, it says there is no magic money tree in inverted commas, but you can do quantitative easing, and that there are very strong arguments to do kind of conditional, like the quantitative easing that's been done at the moment is all just going into growth and capitalism. Mega. Yeah. Whereas if you did a conditional quantitative easing that was ring fenced around care and climate policy, then you can fund anything you want effectively. So money is not the problem in making some of that happen. I totally agree with you there. And particularly in the context of the state of emergency idea. I mean, we saw it during COVID. I mean, money was out there, like, and it didn't have to be given back. There was the IMF were telling people, countries, to keep receipts. I mean, it was mental stuff. Like, it's just been thrown around like confetti. The EU is a more difficult question. I do believe that some of what we're looking at in terms of, if we think of the role of the state in a national context as the planner, that there has to be a planning mechanism at a global level. This is a global problem, and to some degree we have to have some global level solutions, which points to either global institutions or well coordinated regional blocks that have capacity to do things at a global scale. So I do think that we are talking about some governance institutions that have a global or regional character, and they don't need to be the EU as we understand it now. So I'm probably in the system of the more like changing the nature of the regional governance that we have, rather than getting into an anti-EU or what's it, IREXit or whatever it would be. But I mean, looking at the post-growth debate in the EU as well, they call it beyond growth. Yeah, so they didn't want to say degrowth or post-growth, so they said beyond growth. But I mean, it was interesting, and it is interesting how quickly some of these frames become not dominant in the EU by any measure of means, don't get me wrong, but they become kind of a mainstream. You're not mad now in the EU to talk about beyond growth or to try and look for some of these other frames. So I think it is a very pluralistic space still, where you can find some traction for ideas. And I think the role of some of the NGOs at a European level will be very important there in framing and in being ready now and positive debates as well. Like so I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I would have to work hard at a chapter on the EU in the book. There's a reason there wasn't a chapter on it in this book. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't have a fully thought out position on it. But I would agree with you that at the moment it's an EU who's aligned with capital and who's functionally orientated towards serving the needs of capital. I would agree with you with that analysis for sure.
Well, I certainly think in the second edition of the book, and I hope you do a second edition, if you you could integrate quite a lot more of modern monetary theory that would solve a lot of the problems that would be faced by critics of this, including one, the job guarantee. I mean, part of this functional view of state finances is that the state becomes the employer of last resort, but it's actually decided by communities. They go around their community and say, well, what are the jobs that needs to be done? So it's very compatible with many things that you're saying, including care. And I think that idea of a job guarantee, that would also speak to working class concerns. That the just transition, which for a lot of workers is a lot of bullshit. Certainly we speak to the born and owner workers in the middle as they hear just transition, but not actually seeing any jobs. So you see that the transition is a job rich, both formally paid work, but also care work becomes valued. I think that does open up the space for this dialogue now between social justice concerns and climate justice concerns.
I agree with you. I didn't mention it there, but Fiona Duclos in Cork is a social policy academic, and she's done a lot of work on the concept of participation income as a labour market measure or a job guarantee type thing. And there are a lot of arguments for even things like, say, community employment in the south of Ireland is actually a mechanism that it's kind of unusual. It's kind of old-fashioned job, make job kind of active labour market measure that really has been ring-fenced around social good. You know, so now it's sort of people can be honest, doing socially useful participation, and now they can be guaranteed a placement for life if they're a certain age. So it's getting nearer than what it might look like kind of thing. So I agree with you. There's a real tension though. I mean, it's interesting even in the degrowth movement, there's a huge fight going on, a huge fight between the basic income people who are kind of anti-work to some degree, or anti-productivist work, and the job guarantee people who are quite pro the kind of construction of work as an identity kind of thing. So they just can't speak to each other, and yet they're in the same movement, both aligned behind the degrowth principle. But it's just interesting that you don't need to solve all these tensions and all these dilemmas to know the direction of travel that you want to go in. And I think that can be quite useful, because sometimes you can park your differences and you can say, well, we might agree on that, but we can work on the overall thing. And I think that's really important to remember, that we don't all start fighting about the recipe. You know what I mean? When really what we want is the brownie. You know what I mean? That we can agree to differ and park some of these things can be useful sometimes. But I might come back to you if I'm doing a revision of the book for that chapter. I'm not sure I'll be able for it. But I understand quantitative easing in a way that I cannot understand modern monetary theory. I've read it and it leaves me bewildered sometimes, whereas quantitative easing, I guess because I've seen it, I kind of know what it is and I get it. So I do need help with the modern monetary theory.
But just to think about it's that household model is completely inaccurate to understand state finances.
Yeah.
The state does not need to raise taxes to spend. It can literally spend. The only constraint is the actual, that's what inflation is. Too much money chasing too few goods. And that wartime example is a really good one. The British state didn't pay for the debt it incurred for the Second World War until about 3 or 4 years ago. I
know. I get it at a very basic level, but I get lost in it then very quickly when I read an article. I get the cartoon version kind of.
It's also counterintuitive.
Yeah. Well, from what we've been brainwashed into about the nature of money. It's probably enough.
Yeah, that's okay. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. I wanted to know whether you, more than a question, whether you could elaborate on care as a framework for thinking about both growth and the influence of feminist political theory in this. And I just really like this idea of care, not just as I was thinking of care for the elderly, the care sector, but care for nature, care in the economy, and whether that, because that's what you consider in the end as imaginary.
Yeah, and I don't think I say this in the book, but it always strikes me that when we speak the word care, and particularly maybe in the English language, I'm not so sure in other languages, but it's a word that does incredible heavy lifting. Like if we think of the Inuit have 50 words for snow and the Irish have 40 words for green, but we've one word for care, and it covers the vast range of activities that people do, you know, but we only call it care. It says something about how much we socially value some of that activity, I think. But the feminist literature tries, and Joan Tronto would be the feminist drawn on here, defines care. There's 3 dimensions of it. One is the physical act of caring as the narrowest kind of form of it. The second is that wider concept of care of nature and the wider thing. But the other concept is just to care about, like, so that, you know, like that it matters, and that concept of care being politics, the politics of caring about this stuff, and making, so care gets nearer democracy then. So being allowed to care, being allowed to care about, being allowed to have opinions about things and stuff like that. So if we take that wide kind of view of care and try and act on finding time for it, we quickly see that care is undervalued and underplaced in the everyday life of how we get to do things, and that it's so just unevenly distributed across genders and across race, and then other dimensions across class, and it becomes quite intersectionally uneven. So that then gets you into a whole range of, well, what you do about it. And I suppose the three dimensions that need to go forward together. And I think it is one of the problems with all of these debates is we only judge them on one thing, but you've got to redistribute work first to make sure that everybody has a more even amount of time for care in their lives. You've got to socially value care through the income support system in some way. So you've got the unpaid care work has to be valued in some way, and people have to be compensated in some way for doing it. And then services are really important as well. So, but it's the interaction of those 3 things that really matter. So any one of them on their own is incomplete. And I think that's part of the problem with a lot of the policy is people say, I do work on care and I just do work on services, or I do work on care and I do work on this. You find very little that has the palette of options that really concretize a reality of what would make the difference. And I think a feminist approach is quite holistic in that sense, but also very grounded in the woman's experience of care and mindful of that intersectionality issue of who amongst women are caring, not just between men and women, but between women. It's very unevenly divided as well. And that brings class and ethnicity and migration into the picture much more. And then I suppose the other dimension in that as well is the person being cared for, their agency and their voice. And a feminist perspective on care would try and elevate the person on the receiving end of care, if you like, much more centrally into the picture in defining what the care needs are and the circumstances of care and the power. So who gets the money, for example? Is it the carer or is it the person being cared for in order to purchase or contract their care? A lot of that will come into the feminist debate around care. I think it really complicates the debate about care. It makes it much richer to bring in those varieties of dimensions. Yeah.
It's important to see that anyone else online who hasn't, there's nothing.
No questions.
No, go ahead.
Just quick on that, one thing hasn't really gone for that. Is the fact that care in the community is about people who are already, working with their families, with community groups and all the rest of it. But should we not be looking at a more collective whole where everybody in the community helps each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to that idea of the redistribution of work enabling more time for care, because it's not about solely rewarding the people who are doing the care. It's about trying to make different lives so that everybody sees themselves potentially as having a caring role. And a lot of people just don't see themselves potentially as a carer. Even when they are carers, they don't name themselves as carers, or they don't recognise the caring dimension of their lives. Like they could be a father, for example, and have a very significant care role for their own children, but they don't see themselves in that role. So I think there is something about a re-understanding of care, and possibly it's about the language, that framing of it is we need new words to try and multiply out the way people see themselves as carers. But I think potentially it would be that everybody in the community has a role to play, particularly if you extend care out to caring for nature as well. Everybody is carer. Everybody gets care, everybody gives care. And there isn't really another way of seeing the world, you know what I mean? I mean, that is true, you know, and so it's about trying to get people to live their lives that way, and to value their lives that way, maybe. Not to see it as something they throw away, but something to see it as more central.
I actually think what you described there, Mary, in terms of attitudes to care, is that too often policymakers, politics, they have a vision of the human being as usually male, able-bodied and healthy. If you look at the life course of a human being, baby, infant, and then old age, you begin to see at various points in your life you do you're a caregiver, and then you're a receiver of care. And so I think that a more expansive view of the human being across the entirety of our lifespan will open up that space, because there's too often it's that image of a healthy, able-bodied adults, which is true. Most of us in the room probably are, but you know, the reality is that's not how we're always on the
And I think that capability theory that I mentioned earlier on, it does that. It offers that richer view of the person as a giver, a taker, and a judge. You know, the idea of the anthropological human, where we have much more facets to who we are, and multiple roles in life than we are perceived to have. And so we all give, we all take.
Also connected to the feminist issue, particularly, you know, we're all vulnerable, we're all interdependent, we're all dependent. You know, it's a very different vision of the human being than we've been bequeathed by liberalism, the Enlightenment, even aspects of socialist thought. I think that idea of vulnerability as an inevitable condition of being human, I think it's quite transformative in terms of it very much adds to you know, what you're saying in the book. But does anybody have any other questions or comments? Colin?
Just a comment, just to say, it's probably me just coming late to the party and stating the obvious, but I think just in terms of that conversation about care and kind of front loading it as the kind of priority and in a sense the end goal of a transformed welfare society, but particularly for all those reasons that in doing so is and kind of getting to that point, the struggle for more care services or care relations, so we can develop those relations of reciprocity, which in themselves will then kind of challenge those inherited values that you spoke about at the start, about the individualism, which I think is probably at the core to how we perceive care now, is its individualized responsibility and all this.
Yeah, and it's funny, you know, Blackhawks don't think of an elephant. It's the famous kind of article about framing, where he says that if you say don't think of an elephant, you'll just think of an elephant all day. So the very fact that we are focusing on post-growth or degrowth or beyond growth still means that we're thinking of growth all day. Like, we're framing it to think of that. So what the feminists are saying, and I'm part of a network at a European level called the Care-Centric Society, and they're arguing that the frame shouldn't be degrowth or post-growth or beyond growth. It should be care, because that's what you want people to think. That's what we want to frame our heads as. But I think we're, you know, there is, relative to the size of the degrowth movement, they're small and they're only starting up. They're doing good work, but it'll take a long time. So their aim is to take over the degrowth space with the care-centric kind of frame, for those reasons, that it would. So maybe that's a good point to finish on. The care-centric society, that's where we're going.
But before I bring the meeting to a close, I just want to make, I think I was taken by to find out who the person who's advising administration, Francis
Perkins.
You know, the brownie has the recipe and just get off it. Because I'm also reminded of two other, one is definitely in politics that I despise, Milton Friedman, you know, the quote, only a crisis, real or imagined, brings about real change. And it's at that point, ideas lying around, suddenly the politically impossible becomes the expedient.
Yeah, and then that's the ready now.
You know, it's just that's the idea hanging around. There's another more, I don't know, eloquent and not few phrasing of it from E.F. Schumacher, you know, small is beautiful. Where where he says, our job as activists is not to make the wind blow, but when the wind blows, you have the sails ready. So I think really that point of having the ideas there to go, particularly because the crisis we're now in is going to get worse. You know, I don't want to depress people of a Wednesday evening, but the summer we experienced this year is actually going to be a cool year in terms of global temperatures. So I do think we have to be prepared for the struggle ahead, but to have universal basic services, participation income, whether it's a job guarantee, community wealth building. I think this is the job now in terms of, particularly to a frightened people that may go to a populist autocratic direction. You know, I've seen this in France, sadly, you know, Marine Le Pen, you know, very close in the presidential elections. We've been seeing it down the south with those things outside the door and so on. Who would ever thunk it? A far-right movement in Ireland. I think that idea that your book is a provision of hope in a way. Here's the policies that we've worked out. So for me, it's not just a great read, I encourage you all to read it, but also it's an intervention. This can be used, as you say, by activists, by community groups, by ordinary citizens, but it's written in a very reader-friendly manner. And you're also, and I don't know what it is about a more recent crop of female academics, like I said, I'm thinking about Kate Rayworth here, of the visualization, which to me has been a kind of big change in terms of how we're presenting even complex ideas. That is much easier to communicate to people than the abstract kind of jargon-ridden way that we're mostly.
Well, I think in the social media age as well, what means that the visualization is just really important. You only have the 30 seconds to capture somebody, so you gotta do it quickly and ably. So yeah. Well, I mean, if any, like you mentioned trade unions or whatever, but I'm very happy to go talk anywhere. I mean, I wrote it to talk, if you know what I mean. I wrote it to be talked about. I didn't read it to, as I said, to leave it on a shelf or anything like that. So I'm very happy to be part of the conversation and to use it as a tool. So.
There you go. That's an offer.
It's an offer you can't
So
refuse.
a care society and very trade union grants. So can I ask you all to join your hands together and thank her.